blessed.
I'm weak this morning. I got out and mowed grass this weekend and that kind of did me in. But let me tell y'all that just remind you of the importance of raising the funds for the meal trip to Guyana. And the immediacy of the need to go ahead and buy his airline ticket. Because, prices go up and down and fluctuate. And so we need to be praying and responding to that as we can. Got a message from Steve DeLoach, who is the one that we work with down there, Jamil will be with, and his father, Doug DeLoach, who was my teacher in School of Biblical Studies, was put in critical hospice care this past week, and he's not expected to live through the week. And then Steve got to immediately go down to Guyana and begin all the summer's activities, and so he'll be away from his family. So y'all please pray for the DeLoach family and for Steve. Thank you. If I get this thing to work. In the introduction to his last sermon, or last message to Israel, Moses reminded them of the Ten Commandments. And if you read Deuteronomy 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you see, he's reminding them of the history that led them up to Sinai. And then he reminds them of the Ten Commandments in chapter 5. And then he comes to chapter 6, and he says to them, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." All of the laws that God gave to Israel, all that laws in the covenant that God gave Israel, was to help them learn how to love. How to love their neighbors, and how to love God. And it's interesting to me, and I'll say this again in the course of a couple of things that goes on, but it's interesting to me that, Jesus will say, "I came to fulfill the law," and then he'll talk about adultery, he'll talk about coveting, he'll talk about anger, hating, he'll talk about things that involve your relationship to your neighbor in the Sermon on the Mount. And then Paul in Romans 13 will tell the Christians, don't owe anybody anything except to love each other, and then he'll quote those commandments. No adultery, no murder, no stealing, and he'll quote the last 5 of the Ten Commandments. And he'll say that if you love your neighbor, you fulfill the law. Jesus says to come to fulfill the law. I'm going to emphasize that again. I'm just letting you hear and see, laying the foundation for our thought processes this morning. Jesus said that the greatest commandment of the law was what Moses said in Deuteronomy 6:4. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Now, I've said this to y'all as you study the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself was the second greatest commandment. We talked about that last week. And you know where you find that in the law. Did y'all forget already? Leviticus. Not Genesis. Not Exodus. Leviticus. The message to the priests, and the priests were to minister to the nation. By the way, did y'all know that Jeremiah was a priest? Y'all know that John the Baptist was from a priestly family? Many of the prophets were priests to the nation. The great message or the great ministry of the priest was not so much to offer the sacrifices, although they had to mediate those, but was to teach Israel. To teach them how to keep teach thee to love the Lord their God with all their heart and soul and might. Well, having that foundation laid, you'll hear me say some of that again. Jesus said this is the greatest commandment of the law. He said to them in Matthew 22:37-38, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. Now, when he says first, you know what he means, don't you? You don't mean that's the first commandment he gave. He means it's the primary commandment. It's the most important command of the law. The very most important command of the law was to love God. And by the way, I'm convinced, and I'll talk about this, I'm convinced that the first 5 of the 10 commandments is the foundation, loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength is described or encouraged in the first 5 of the 10. You know, the Jews call the 10 commandments the 10 words from God. We use that word accommodatively a lot today, don't we? Let's hear a word from God. Preacher, let's hear a word from God. Well, love. That's the word. Let's go. That was the word. No, we know that's not what we meant. We didn't mean a word. We meant a message. And it's very interesting how we deal with the law and churches of Christ. But not just churches of Christ. Our religious world, our modern religious world. But in churches of Christ, we have a unique way of dealing with it, rather than different than what we call the denominational world. And I'm convinced that the unique way we deal with it is not based on our study of the Bible, but it's based on what Alexander Campbell said, and then what everybody quoted him as saying. And so the Old Testament is not so important anymore because we're New Testament Christians. We're not under the law, we're under the new law. We're not under the old law, we're under the new law. And see, that's not even close to what the Bible teaches. What we're not under is that old covenant that God made with Israel. We're under the new covenant that God made through Jesus Christ, the Christians. That's what we need to get in our mind. We are covenant people. Covenanted to have a relationship with God. Jesus said he came to fulfill the law. We saw this last week. I'm just reiterating it, so I'll go pretty fast. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them. I have not come to abolish them. They will not be abolished. I came to fulfill it. Much of the time we're teaching that they were abolished. And logically we know that can't be true. And emotionally we know that can't be true. Talking about that. But notice that Jesus fulfilled the law. He fulfilled it. He accomplished it. He brought it to perfection, to maturity, to the reality with which God intended to start with. Jesus loved God like no other man loved God. Our problem, knowing that Jesus is God, we kind of rationalize stuff. Jesus exemplified loving God with his life. I always do the things that are pleasing to my Father, he said in John neighbor. Have you fulfilled the law? Paul then quoted the second 5 of the 10 Commandments. You know, don't murder, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. And do you remember when the rich young ruler came running to Jesus and said, "Good master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said, "You know the commandments." And Jesus quoted, "Don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't kill, don't." You didn't hear either one of those say, "There's only one God, don't make any idols, don't take his name in vain," because that's the fulfillment of the law. You don't hear anybody talking about that today. And yet it is. It seems to me like that's the only rational, when we look at how Paul and Jesus and the apostles applied those things to the neighbor, that you and I need to also understand that that's got to be applied to God. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Paul said doing those commandments was loving your neighbor. And then in that verse 10, remember, he said if there's anything else, it sums up in love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. If there's some other stuff that needs to be put in there, it sums up in loving your neighbor as yourself. John says, if you don't love your brother, you don't love God. It don't matter how much you say you love God. And none of us ever say, well, I love God, but what comes next? Boy, don't we presume too much. We presume to want to speak for God. I was talking about how you deal with neighbors that treat you badly. I'm talking about literal neighbors. We got neighbors there next door who probably on Monday night, will be playing their music loud and proud. They'll have their big memorial party, backyard barbecue, and be blasting that. And Judah and I'll be sitting in the den trying to listen to their TV, and we got to listen to their music. And sit there and fume. See, think bad thoughts about it. I was talking about that, and I said, you still got to love your neighbors. And one of the members came to me afterwards and said, Joe, you don't know my neighbors. Jesus said, if you don't love your brother, you're not loving God. So somehow, in the middle of all that, we've got to figure out how to love. How to act loving. Even when we're being abused and misused and accused. Somehow, that's what God has wanted all the time. That's what God wanted from Adam and Eve. That's what he wanted from Cain and Abel. That's what he wanted with the world before the flood. But he didn't get it. That's what he wants from you and me. Does he get it? John says, he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. So we get down to the nitty-gritty, what we really want to think about. Loving God is the fulfillment of the law. The law of God. The law of the God of love. The law of the God who wants us to be like him. He wants to teach us to be like him. How do you command somebody to love somebody? You better love him. Well, that's not good to broken? How many commandments you broke? I thought God commanded you to do it. Why did you break them? Commandments don't get the job done. Whenever we, like historical man all down through time, but especially the Jews of the nation of Israel, want to point out the letter of the law. Here's what it says, and I didn't do that. Therefore, all right. Read the Sermon on the Mount again, and hear Jesus say, "You've heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, but I say." Here's what you hear your teachers say. You can get away with it. But I say to you, it's a whole lot more spiritual than that. It's a whole lot more eternal than that. When God talked to Israel about the prophets, he said that they spoke for him. Now, you need to go back and read Exodus. No, boy, don't make me read Exodus. You need to go back and read Leviticus. Oh, really, preacher? Leviticus? But you really need to read Deuteronomy. And hear Moses say something to the effect of what he's going to say right now about the prophets, but he'll say it in other areas of application. You better listen to those prophets, because if they're false prophets, you see, he said, "You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams." Now here's the punchline. Listen. "For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul." God allows those false prophets to come along to test you. Do you really love God with all your heart and your soul? Because when a prophet comes along saying things in opposition to God, you don't listen to him. Boy, what does that do with all those people who have itching ears and want the prophet or the preacher to preach what they want to hear? Want their ears to be tickled. The Lord is testing you to find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart. You know, Moses said that 4 times at the process of the elders to Israel. There is only one God. The God who saves. Do you know how the Lord began the giving of the Ten Commandments to the nation of Israel at Sinai? "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt." There ain't but one of me. And he wanted them to remember that God was the one who took the initiative to save them, to bring them out of their bondage. When you bring them out of their bondage, I'll say that again. Secondly, when you love God, you know there's nothing which looks like him. There's nothing in this world, nothing you can conjure up or imagine. There is nothing that looks like God from which you could use to make an image. Now you know my story. This is an old story, so y'all just deal with it. Teacher was teaching Bible class, and she said, "Okay, I want y'all to draw a picture about something you learned in Sunday school this morning." And boy, Johnny grabbed his paper, and he just started working up a storm. And he's just working. Teacher walked over behind him and said, "Johnny, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher said, "Now, Johnny, you know nobody ever seen God and knows what God looks wait a minute, you will. Just wait a minute. When I get through this picture, you'll know what he looks like. Do you know how many of us have painted pictures of God? And do you know how many of us were wrong about our picture? Not even close to being completely right, totally right about God. And in all our sinfulness and fleshliness, there is no way we can imagine that God of the Bible. He had to reveal himself and give us evidence. We couldn't imagine it. And still we read things and we say, what? Huh? There's nothing from which to make an image of God. And you see my grandma with that. I put a D on the end of that hand. That's just an A. The reason why I point that out is because some of you didn't see it, but some of you probably saw it. But look at there, his grandma was wrong. Paul tells the Colossians, therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality and impurity and passion and evil desire. And here's the phrase I wanted to get to. And greed, which amounts to idolatry. Now, what image is that? What is the image of greed? How can you make an idol out of greed? Well, you know we're not talking literal, are we? We're not talking just sit here and make a physical. But you can do it. Have y'all saw those commercials, those insurance commercials about saving Benjamin and Lincoln? And they show the characters. You know, Benjamin Franklin is running on top of the thing, and the guy says, jump in here. And then he talks about saving Benjamin. I actually talk about saving money. Benjamin's pictures on others, you know, President Washington and so forth. So let's save those presidents. Let's save that money. How do you feel the line out of greed? Well, just look at our lives. Look at the lives of people in our lives. Whatever image you have in your mind as your idol, it is not God. Whatever that image is, it ain't God. There's nothing from which you could make a likeness of God. Only God could make a likeness of God, and he did it in a form that we would have never imagined again. He did it in the form of Jesus. He is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature. Hebrews 1 verse 3. No idols. And when you say you love God, you better mean it. Don't you take his name in vain. What lessons? What applications? Read Romans, read Galatians, read Ephesians, read Philippians, read James, read Peter. And remember, he's the one who brought you out of bondage to sin. You know, that's what the Sabbath was, something. It was the day set aside for them to don't do anything else but remember. But not just remember anything. Remember that God brought them out of bondage. He's the one who forgives our sins. He's the one who takes the chains off. He's the one who frees us to choose to love. told that Samaritan lawyer we looked at, Sadducee lawyer, that Sadducee lawyer that we looked at last week in Luke, do this, and you'll live. Because if you love God, you won't pursue keeping His commandments. But if you love God, you want to keep the spirit of all those commandments. Not just boil it down to a letter. 1, 2, 3. I did this, this, and this, so therefore I'm saved. Remember, it's not just the letter of the law that's important. That wasn't what was important in Moses' day. Read the book of Exodus and you'll get to this